Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is another edition of Overfed and Undernourished. Before we get started into the main topic, some of you may be wondering when the cat will appear. I'm sorry to tell you that the cat will not be appearing because the cat has been quarantined at Guantanamo Bay, and it is undergoing intensive, enhanced interrogation and re-education under the guidance of the Dick Cheney School of Enhanced Interrogation. So we will not be seeing the cat in this particular edition of Overfed and Undernourished. Now I feel that I have to say, of course I'm just kidding, because all of the animal rights and PETA people will begin having heart palpitations and everything else. So it was just a little humor into something else. And the something else is very important. The something else has to do with, today is September 16th. Yesterday, the 15th, was really a historic day. Not only for the United States and for the Arab nations involved and for Israel itself, but really for the world. In the midst of our obsession with virus and violence, a beacon of hope, a beacon of peace, shone across this war-weary and virus-weary world. And it took place in Washington, D.C. And of course, I'm talking about the Abraham Accords that were signed by President Trump and representatives from two Arab nations, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, and of course the United States of America, who actually brokered the deal and put the accords together and brought the parties together, of which we are told by the President that there are at least 5 more Arab nations wanting to join what President Trump has called the Circle of Peace, the Circle of Peace. And this historic agreement is something that should be celebrated, not only in the United States and in the Middle East, but worldwide. It shows what can happen when old wounds, old hatreds, old violence, they are laid aside and they are healed by the balm of peace, prosperity, and mutual protection, especially in the Middle East, which many have described as the most dangerous neighborhood in the world, because you have all of the players there. You have the terrorists, you have those that sponsor state terrorism, specifically Iran. You have them being supported by some of the superpowers, such as Russia and China. And really, the United States is the only nation in the world, that could broker, that could bring together these parties that for millennia have been divided, have been involved in destruction and involved in killing, the loss of life, and of so much that could be achieved and will be achieved as more and more have the courage to walk in peace rather than to seek solutions through war, which of course turns out to be no solutions at all. And for the past 72 years since Israel, in the modern world, since Israel has become a state, recognized as an independent state, the history up to the present has been one of war and violence, the growth, tremendous growth of terrorism, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. And all of that destruction, that loss of life, that loss of potential, that loss of real world development is really a tragic episode in world history. And yesterday, these age-old, quote-unquote, enemies laid all of that aside, met at the White House, and signed the Abraham, what a fitting name, the Abraham Accords for diplomatic recognition, access to trade, travel, full diplomatic relations, This is an incredible step. And we can only hope and pray that those who had the courage to make that first step will also be able to be a witness and a light to others in the region, that there's so much more to gain, and there's absolutely nothing to gain by continuing in violence, in hatred, destruction, and death. It advances no one. It is befitting no group, no nation, and no people to live that way. That's not the way God. That's not the way the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob expected us to live, wants us to live. But we have freedom, and the path is clear. The path to prosperity and freedom, mutual security, protection, or the way to death, the way to terrorism, the way to destruction, and that is mutually assured destruction, because nobody wins. Nobody wins. History teaches us that. Wars end, and it's simply a break on the way to the next war. That's what history teaches us. It's when we really reconcile and really allow God's grace, God's action in human history to settle in, where hearts and minds are changed, where hearts and minds are changed, not simply of leaders, but of peoples of the world. This moment can really be that opening of a door, that clearing of a path to a better and more hopeful future. And in the midst of this accord, against the backdrop of viruses and violence, especially here in the United States, we should all celebrate and gravitate to that remarkable moment yesterday at the White House. Unfortunately, in the past months, we have been treated to the notion that medicine, health, the call for order, civic tranquility, that has become partisan. Amazing as that may sound, that has become a partisan thing in this toxic environment. You know, we have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. There ought to be a special office there for that rhetoric and those hyperbolic kinds of eruptions that take place between individuals and groups that are truly toxic to the civic air that we breathe. And here, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of this fog of hatred, this fog of division and partisanship and of violence, there shines the beam that is not overcome by that darkness, that shines through the fog. And it was this truly historic moment in which, for the last 27 years, nothing had been done. In fact, things had gotten worse. Between the Camp David Accords and yesterday, things had gotten progressively worse, especially with the exponential growth of terrorism around the world and certainly in the Middle East. And President Trump, to his credit, again, let's please leave the partisanship alone. Let's leave that stuff die for at least a few moments. That's not a bridge too far to walk, really. And he said that the old strategy is not working. It's a bipartisanship of failure. Republicans and Democrats have tried to buy off, to appease terrorists and despots and tyrants with money, with various kinds of incentives and appeasements, and all it did, as history again teaches us, it only feeds the beast. It only increases the appetite, because appeasement is seen as weakness. And you can't buy off a blackmailer, and you can't buy off a bully. Children on the playground know that. If the bully makes you give them your money for lunch, tomorrow they'll want your homework, and the next day they may want your jacket. And there's no end to it. There's no end to it. It's when good people, good nations who are seeking justice and true peace stand up to terrorists, despots, bullies on the world stage, that we begin to move towards real peace. And so the president decided that instead of appeasement and trying to satisfy the insatiable appetite of the terrorist beast, namely Iran, that what we would do is seek a way to build what he called a circle of peace among the other Arab nations in the Middle East who have a great deal of distrust and disdain for Iran and its maddening drive to gain a nuclear weapon, to become the bully of the bloc in the Middle East, what the Arab nations as a whole do not want. And so there was a real paradigm change that took place from appeasement to one of building the circle of peace and inviting those who really want peace to enter. At his participation speech yesterday, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said, "Only those who know the sufferings of war can truly long for and appreciate the healing of peace." So eloquent and so beautifully said. That's what people who have suffered, people who have known the ravages of war, they crave peace. They want that. They want it for themselves. They want it for their posterity, their children and their children's children. They want it for their families. They want it for their nation. They want it for the world. And yesterday was one of those magnificent celebratory moments. Unfortunately, and I have to say this, our mainstream media, print and electronic, gave practically no, if any, coverage yesterday to this historic event. Once again, fermenting division, partisanship, separation over violence and viruses. This is no service. So disappointing. This is no service, especially in an election year when you expect a certain amount of partisanship. We have it year-round, year after year. But even for a moment, to call a timeout. Soldiers in World War I took a timeout at Christmas, Germans and Allies, to celebrate Christmas together. We know no such peace in our partisan war that's taking place. And a total, in many of the major outlets, no mention at all of this historic moment. This kind of censorship, and that's what it is, this kind of partisan censorship does not serve the electorate, because as the founders understood, the essence of a republic, we the people, must be the oxygen of information and news that is true and accurate, that is complete, so that every citizen can make up his or her own mind on the leading issues of the day. We are not served by that. We are very ill-served by that kind of approach. It really is another nail in the coffin of journalism in the service of the Republic, in the service of truth. Journalism dying to its own high ideals, to bring the truth to the citizens regardless of who it affects in positions of power and privilege. Those days, I'm afraid, are growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror of our collective memory. And we all suffer because of that. But that is not going to deter from the great achievement yesterday. And we really, I think, need to pray to Almighty God that other leaders around the world will walk through that door and go down that path Again, not simply for themselves, but for those who come after, because we have a duty and a responsibility to leave the world safer, more peaceable, more prosperous than when we found it. May it be said of us that we, in our moment of testing, were not found wanting.